What's that sound? It's for amusement only, the EM and Bingo Pinball Podcast.
Welcome back to For Amusement Only. This is Nick Baldridge. Today I thought we'd spend a moment and talk about bingos and the law. Now, I'm not fully aware of all the history, but I do know a few things. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, bingos were considered gambling devices, and so Bally had to continue to innovate in order to stay one step ahead of the law. Well, interestingly, games would continue to be en route that had been outlawed, and what would happen is, because Bally was continuing to put out these new innovations, new bingos were not immediately taken and destroyed or removed from route or any other penalty imposed, fines or whatever, to the operator or establishment that had them. What they would do is they would have a list of games that had been outlawed because of their features and the amount of replays that they gave out, etc. And so law enforcement would go around with these lists of games, and if the name on the sheet that they had matched what was on the back glass, then they would take the machine and destroy it, or again they would impose fines or other penalties. So what clever operators would do is to repaint the back glass. They would scrape off the original name and paint on a new one, or they would disable, for example, the red letter game entirely and remove those portions of the back glass. In some instances, even repainting the entire glass. So what prompted me to talk about this was a posting on Facebook in the Mid-Atlantic Pinballs for Sale group, I think. And someone had posted a Bally Tahiti, which is a Mystic Line game, and it had been completely repainted, the back glass. So they left the odds section in place. They had repainted the bingo card so that the blue section was purple, and they had, or that had faded, I'm not really sure which. But they had repainted the rest of the glass to remove the name, and they removed some of the features. Well, the only reason to do this is to prevent law enforcement from figuring out what was going on. Now, another thing that I've seen is that certain odds would be removed. This was less usual and not caused by law enforcement. It was just something the operator wanted to do to make more money. Another interesting thing that happened that Bally did in order to stay ahead of the law was, in certain states, they put out games that didn't award replays. Now, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, there was the add a ball versus replay in certain states like New York. And in Ohio, New York, and Pennsylvania, Bally put out these games that scored points. And so they had lights on the back glass that would light up various point values based on the number you got 3, 4, or 5 in a row. Now, this number would go away when the machine was turned off and back on, so technically you could get paid off of these machines too. But there was no replay counter, and so they were able to skirt the law effectively. And you could make much more of an argument that this was an amusement-only device, because there are no replays. However, most likely there was still the same stuff going on, even with these games. They cost $0.10 a piece, and they gave you one card. They were all 6-card games, and so you drop in additional dimes to get additional cards. So another thing that's been kind of a mystery to me, as I've been in the bingo collecting world, has been why the serial numbers don't match on cabinets and play fields. And I'm sure everybody is already aware of this, that is already heavily involved with bingos, but I kind of had an aha moment earlier this week when I saw a Maryland operator post that their dad used to take games and assemble them in their basement. And what he meant by that is that in Maryland, for example, you couldn't put a game on route, a bingo game, that had all matching serial numbers. Apparently, the secondhand market was good enough, and they didn't think anybody would go to the trouble of doing this, but obviously they were wrong because there was a lot of money in bingos. What his dad would do would be to contact the distributor and buy replacement playfields with different serial numbers and install those in the cabinets. And so they would pick them up from different places and bring them home, install them, and then put the game on route. And that was legal. It's an interesting loophole. So if you ever go to pick up a bingo and it's got serial numbers that don't match, that might be why, especially if you're in my neck of the woods. One other thing that's interesting, I had mentioned in my horse race game podcast about how some machines were really one ball, but they actually shot 5 balls and 4 were trapped. Well, that was because of the Johnson Act, and this was the big piece of pinball legislation that really changed the face of American pinball. Pinball machines were classified as gambling devices. And not just these horse race games, but all pin games. So, the industry's advent of the flipper skirted the Johnson Act by making them amusement devices and games of skill rather than games of chance, at least in law enforcement's eyes. So, the answer to this horse race dilemma for Bally and United, which at the time was Universal, was to manufacture bingos. So that's when bingos came to be. It was because of the Johnson Act. Now, because they offered 5 balls, or up to 8 balls, instead of a single ball, they were able to skirt this provision of the Johnson Act that required more than one chance. Now, that came under fire almost immediately, and so in 1957, the Corpin decision in the Supreme Court ruled bingos as gambling devices under the Johnson Act. Now, each state was able to make their own decision, and in Tennessee and South Carolina, they were legal to operate. And Bally continued to make bingos and ship them to the foreign market, and then there were other, kind of shadier methods of getting the games out there. Did you ever wonder why bingos are not made today by Stern or whomever? Well, it's because Tennessee, which was the last holdout, finally outlawed bingos in the early 80s. And so with the primary market, the U.S., completely closed off, Bally said, forget it. We don't make enough money on the export games. Now, another provision of the Johnson Act, which is kind of hard to see in a bingo in the same way, and this is intentional, this is by design, is the knockoff button. So in earlier games, you could have replays stacked up on a meter, and the proprietor could come and push a button to knock off the replays. Well, this is so they could pay you out if you won. On a bingo, there is no knockoff button. Instead, it just so happens if you turn the game off and back on, it zeroes out the meter. It's not quite the same thing, but also pretty much the same thing. So you're able to claim that you're complying with the letter of the law, but really you're not complying with the spirit. Just some very interesting ways of getting around the laws at the time. Now, another interesting thing to note is that Bally and United were not the only ones making these amusement devices that could be used for gambling purposes, should you so choose. There was Keeney, and Williams made a couple of bingos, and Gottlieb used to make one-ball horse race games. In fact, there's one called the New Daily Races, which is something I wouldn't mind owning. I'm sure there's probably 3 of them left in existence. But that's a one-ball made by Gottlieb, and I would love to see what the difference is between the Gottlieb version and a Bally horse race game. It looks like from IPDB they have the same kind of payoff trough, and I'm sure that mechanism is pretty similar. Just interesting to think about. But at any rate, for our tech today, I don't have anything that fits in with the law per se, but I do have backglass recreation and restoration. So I figure since we're talking about how backglasses were altered, I could say a word or two about how I've repaired backglasses, since that's a common problem in older games. I have a machine from 1937 called Junior, and it was made by Genko. And Junior came to me with all of the light blue completely flaked away, and all the silver stayed intact, but other colors were dimmed, and there was a burn spot in front of one of the bulbs. Well, eventually that got on my nerves enough that I decided to do something about it. And being, a computer-y guy, I decided that I could fix it digitally and then have it printed. So what I ended up doing, because Junior is a countertop game, which we'll get to in another episode, it's got a small backglass compared to, say, a typical EM pinball made in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So I thought it'd be a good thing to start with. And also, most of the paint was there. It's just what was there was kind of barely holding on after almost 100 years. So what I did, I made sure that I set the backglass down carefully on an area that was all one color. And that color would not show through the glass very much. And I photographed it from the front and from the back. And I made sure the angle was as close as I could get it. Then I took those photos and brought them into a free program that I use for photo editing. I don't use Photoshop because it costs hundreds of dollars. I use a program called the GIMP. And it's got a terrible name, and it's actually an acronym. It stands for New Image Manipulation Program, but it's got some of the same feature set as Photoshop. Not entirely, but it can do enough to do this. So when it was in there, I made sure that all of the circles were circular, made sure that all the numbers were put in and touched up as appropriate, made sure that all the colors were matched. Where they were faded, I made sure they were all the same color. And then I did the same with the masking. So I used the masking photo I had taken as a reference. I didn't use it and then restore that. I just took the front image and then flipped it inside of the GIMP. There's one function you can perform for that. Made a new layer and saved this as a separate file. And on that second layer, which starts off invisible or transparent, I took black and painted the sections which should not have light flow through. Once this was done, then I had glass cut 2 pieces, each the same size, but half the thickness of the back glass. So I end up with the same thickness, approximately, and the same size and shape. And then the hard part was finding a company that would print it on a material that I thought would work. So the issue typically with reprinting a back glass is that you're not rescreening it onto glass like it was done initially. Instead, what you're doing is printing it on a mylar surface. And the mylar or plastic type film works the best for this purpose. And I've had reprints, like I have one on Bounty, where it was done in 2 separate pieces, and then you have to make sure that they are stacked appropriately when you put it back together. That's very difficult. It's a lot easier if you can have the printing company print it on one piece, and then you install it in the machine. One shot. Pretty simple. So that's exactly what I did. I just farmed it around here, the Richmond area, till I found a printing company that would do it. I sent the file over to him and said, hey, can you do this in this way? I am most concerned with accurate color reproduction, and when light shines behind it, if the masking actually prevents the light from bleeding out. And they were able to answer all my questions. They were able to print on a translucent stock instead of a white stock, which allows more light to shine through. And it looks great now. There's no burn. All the colors are there. The only thing that suffers a bit is the silvery. It's not quite mirroring, or if it's mirroring on the original, it is very, very fine. It's not quite the same there, so I guess it is mirroring. At any rate, it is much better than it did look, and because the cabinet had already been restored by a previous owner, it looks beautiful now. The playfield is original, and it's got some patina, but I tell you, it looks great, and it plays very well. So, if I've also gone this route, if you've seen my Facebook page with the shattered back glass for a game called Mystery, and that was a 1947 wood rail made by Exhibit. Now, because it was shattered, I took packing tape and taped it together from the front, and then laid it down, photographed it, both sides, took it color corrected, fixed, the parts of the image where the tape had gone across and reflected. Oh, and one important note, if you're photographing a back glass, you want to make sure that you're in a well-lit area where you can see the colors very well, and also that you're not using a flash, because it will reflect off of the glass, and then you'll have no idea what you're looking at. So the hardest part to reproduce on Mystery was the bottom right corner, because that's apparently where it had been dropped and split. And it shattered in that one corner. This took many hours, and I frequently called on my wife to double check my work. However, the finished product is beautiful, and again, the back glass helps make the game. Without it, it's not the same. So, especially on a game from the 40s where it's lighted scoring. So if you can't see what your score is, it's kind of hard to play. Well, that's all for today. Thank you for joining me. My name again is Nick Baldridge. You can find us online at foramusementonly.libsyn.com. You can contact me at foramusementonlypodcast@gmail.com. And you can find us in iTunes, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, RSS, and Facebook. Thanks very much. Talk to you next time.